Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. Now we'll be looking at major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and other areas, and discussing some of the Times Radio expert analysis that we've seen this week. The first one I want to you to have a look at and to recommend is from Sean Bell, who is a commentator like myself on many issues around the different conflicts around the world. But this one, he's looking at the Black Sea deal that seems to have come out from the negotiations between the Americans and the Ukrainians and the Americans and the Russians.
Yesterday, we had the news that Russia and Ukraine have agreed to a ceasefire in the Black Sea. Is that in both of their interests, Sean, or does it benefit one side more than the other? I'm thinking primarily of the way that Ukraine has really decimated the Black Sea fleet over recent years. Is it not more in Russia's interest to have that ceasefire?
You're absolutely right, James. I mean, the trouble with all of this is that if you look at it from a military perspective, a ceasefire in the Black Sea really only benefits Vladimir Putin. So why is it happening? Almost certainly because President Trump wants to be able to announce that there is some form of ceasefire, that he is making progress in bringing the war to an end. And he is obviously playing his own game with President Putin, trying to gradually coax him into a wider ceasefire, but focusing initially on that maritime thing. There's a lot of talk that it secures Ukrainian grain exports, and in return, gives access for Russian banks to the SWIFT system that allows them to export, I think it's agriculture and fertilizers. But actually, if you look at it, that sounds like some sort of equitable deal. But first of all, as you say, the Russian Black Sea fleet has been terrorized out of the Black Sea. Also, grain exports, which for a couple of years we were commenting on because Ukraine couldn't export their grain. My understanding is grain exports are up to their pre-war levels already. So there's no benefit for Ukraine in signing this. And what it does do is it not only gives Vladimir Putin a small benefit, but the massive thing it provides is it's an easing of sanctions. It's the first step of taking the foot off the throat of Russia, when, it wasn't that many days ago when President Trump was saying if President Putin doesn't sort of shift at all, we'll have to put more sanctions on. So, the whole idea that you're now taking your foot off the throat of Russia, you're easing sanctions, that sounds like a pathway that will only embolden President Putin. Just imagine how delighted he will be that actually he's being brought in from being a pariah to some form of partner, and without actually having to give up very much at all. Now, maybe this is just the first step, and this is part of a grander strategy to get Putin to agree. But bluntly, I'm a military guy. We talked literally about a week or so ago about some ceasefire in the air, that they weren't going to attack each other's energy infrastructure. Once again, bluntly, Putin, the one thing that President Zelenskyy has been able to do to hurt Putin is tack his oil and gas export business. That's what generates revenue. That's what's been hurting President Putin. Therefore, by agreeing to stop targeting energy infrastructure, it actually favors President Putin far more than it does President Zelenskyy. So all these things really, President Putin is the bad guy. He's the guy who invaded Ukraine at the start of all this, yet here we are offering appeasements to stop Ukraine hurting Russia. That doesn't feel to me like the foundations of a lasting ceasefire.
And, Sean very much sees this as giving in to Putin. And he says that if you go through the detail in the deal, that Putin has got so much more out of it rather than the Ukrainians. And I tend to agree with what Sean is saying. I urge you to watch the video. But the one thing I will say is that I think Zelenskyy wants to show to Donald Trump that he's going to cooperate over something. And if we look at what's happened in the Black Sea anyway, the Ukrainians have effectively defeated or rendered inoperative the majority of the Russian Black Sea fleet, having sunk about a third of it and damaged about half of it, and forced it out of its main ports in the occupied areas of Crimea and back into Russia. Ukraine's ability to export its grain and other foodstuffs from its ports have largely been unhampered by Russian activity, and the Russians have focused themselves into local coastal patrols and no more. Ukraine's threat with its sea drones and everything else have effectively dominated the Black Sea. So there's not much that Ukraine can continue to do in the Black Sea area. And if they can guarantee safety for export of even more foodstuffs, even if that means that the Russians can do some of it themselves, then I think that is probably a concession that Zelenskyy is happy with, if he's getting more out of the Americans and can force his hand on other parts of any peace agreement. Of course, we haven't seen anything else that had been proposed come forward into a ceasefire or some form of peace settlement. So Sean's hitting the nail on the head, as he always does. Expanding that slightly in our next video, and this is with Matthew Saville from RUSI.
So where we are at the moment is that the Russians have been grinding their way forwards and are very, very slowly taking ground, or it appears even in the last month or so that they've essentially been held up even more by Ukrainian resistance, and they're sort of have switched to something that is a bit more attritional in terms of inflicting losses on the Ukrainians that they don't think the Ukrainians can sustain in the long term. But if you look at their original objectives and the way that indeed the Russians still talk about this, they wanted to effectively remove the existing government and replace it with something that was less Western leaning, not going to be a member of NATO, probably not going to join the EU, and less of a, as they saw it, threat to Russia, and indeed was essentially within their orbit. And they talk about Ukraine in these pretty dismissive terms as not really being a proper country. And it's slightly concerning if you're Ukrainian or a international backer of Ukraine to hear the US Special Envoy for Russia repeating some of those claims in various interviews and places recently. I think the Russians are short, obviously, of a lot of those big objectives. They haven't toppled the government. They didn't take Kyiv. They haven't taken the territory in the four big oblasts on top of Crimea that they have been looking to effectively join up. And that is, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. So they haven't achieved their overall objectives, although they might be moderately satisfied with what they've done in terms of taking about 20% of Ukraine's territory to now. But that is not overall mission success for them.
And Witkoff also went on to dismiss the idea of this UK French-led European reassurance force. I mean, is a ceasefire of this magnitude, considering the size of this conflict now, is that possible without no physical presence or assurance, security assurance to back it up? I mean, is there a history of that, of a war like this ending that way?
I think we should differentiate between the ceasefire and what the reassurance force is there to really do. It is not a peacekeeping force, and I think that's a misuse of the term. That those are usually neutral. They keep the combatants apart. They monitor ceasefires. I don't think this has ever really been seen in that kind of mold. I mean, this is a force that would be on the side of the Ukrainians, there to reassure them and perhaps deter future Russian aggression. So I think that is a different beast. I think the terms of the ceasefire are really about partly the exhaustion of the two combatants at the moment and what they are hoping to get out of it in setting conditions for more substantive talks. I think if I were honest, the way that the ceasefire talks are currently going, it's not really a particularly stable ceasefire on paper. And that's partly because the Russians, as I said, won't have actually achieved all of their objectives. But if you're Ukrainian, it would be a particularly unsatisfactory situation to have 20% of the country out of your control, and some of that front line in particular being in quite unfavourable places, higher ground, a lodgement of Russian forces north in Kharkiv, heading down the Oskil River. So, Zaporizhia, the nuclear power plant, they're still in Russian hands. So if the US is attempting to freeze the conflict, or as it claims, prevent any return to future fighting, there's still quite a lot to do to actually create a compromise that is satisfactory to both parties. I mean, it's definitely not in Ukraine's favour at the moment.
Matthew, puts into context a little bit of what's going on back into the historical objectives of the Russians, talking about the Russians' strategic objective being the overthrow of the Zelenskyy government, the bringing a puppet government into Kyiv, and effectively turning Ukraine into a puppet state in the way that Belarus seems to be, and its relationship with Russia. And Russia has failed at that from a strategic perspective. Matthew, you describes how he thinks that the Russians are, trying to make it a happy second that they will take the what they call the disputed Donbass region. But militarily, over the last 3 years, they haven't managed to be able to take it and capture all of the territories. They only have captured some of the territories. Ukrainians have been holding them back defensively the whole way through. However, when it comes to trying to put points out for peace negotiations, the Russians are trying to ask for the whole of the territory and to get more than they've managed to capture militarily. And this is where Matthew starts to increase the debate and looking around and question what it is the Americans are doing, and highlights the fact that we're now starting to see rhetoric that was coming out of Moscow being put out by Donald Trump or members of the Trump team, and he's shocked at seeing that. He then goes on to talk about what a reassurance force would be from the EU or the coalition of the willing, should there be any peace deal signed, and emphasises the fact that nothing that will be produced will be a peacekeeping force, that'll not be configured. It seems to be misunderstood that there will be a peacekeeping force. It seems to be misreported in a lot of the press that's there. And this ties in very much with what I've had in other discussions over the last week. And looking at it, I think at one level it could be no more than taking the training of Ukrainian troops that is currently happening in the UK and other nations and concentrating that back into Ukraine with coalition of the willing troops carrying out that training and acting as a trigger if the Russians try and do anything more aggressive, up to there being some form of maneuver capability that, if called on by Ukraine, could go and investigate ceasefire breaches. But we're a long way off that. Trying to get an understanding of what the coalition of the willing can do and is willing to do is going to be a long and torturous process. With all of that, there'll have to be some form of ceasefire in the air. And if we get air patrolling of the region and we get Western air forces operating over Ukraine, then there is an even greater danger of them coming into a period where they may have to engage with Russian assets that are flying through. Of course, if that happens outside any peace agreement, it can be a bilateral agreement between the Ukrainians and each of the nations of the coalition of the willing, or a bilateral agreement between the Ukrainians and the coalition of the willing, if that's formed into some form of more formal body, and therefore it can be dealt with out with any peace agreement. So any ceasefire or peace agreement can turn around and not talk about a peacekeeping force, a peace enforcement force, the deployment of NATO forces. Ukraine as a sovereign state can get agreements and can ask anyone to come in and help them. And that's where I think it's going to go. Continuing on with the Ukraine side, we had President Zelenskyy in Paris, and he sat down and had a television interview with a number of journalists from different European states. I'll let you watch this.
I think that Witkoff often cites the Kremlin narrative. I agree with you, and I think that this does not get us close to peace. I think this sadly will weaken the pressure of the US on the Russian Federation, and we can do little more than try to restore the flow of information. I have spoken with President Trump more than once. We are trying to share real and truthful information since Witkoff's declarations disturb us a lot, since we are fighting Putin and we do not want him to receive support. We are already fighting against a country that is 40 times bigger than ours, so much bigger than ours, and I've always said to President Trump that we want the US to be on our side. And even if the US has chosen to be in the middle, then they need to stay in the middle and not come closer to the Kremlin. The majority of Americans have always supported us, and I'm very grateful to them for that. We have had bipartisan support, and I cannot be ungrateful to America for all it has done. However, today, very often, I believe it is often under the influence of the Russian narrative which we cannot accept. But we will continue to fight for ourselves, and we will continue to fight against this narrative, wherever it comes from.
Who is Putin afraid of? Let's start with this. The only thing Putin is afraid of is his people. The destabilization of the society is what he's afraid of. But nobody can influence this, only he himself. The economy, the policy of sanctions, the fact that he does not control and does not protect all of his territories, it will be a combination of various factors. Going back to what I said before, if all of our allies remain as strong as they are, if they demonstrate not some superpowers but real strength, they can continue to put pressure on Putin. Destabilization of his society will follow, and that is what he's afraid of.
Якщо вони будуть тиснути на Путіна, у нього буде дестабілізація його суспільства, він буде боятися цього. Тобто Путін боїться цього. Друге, чого він боїться, втратити свою...
The second thing he is afraid of is the loss of power. This depends on the stability in the society, but also of his age. He will die soon. That is a fact. Everything will be over then. I mean, the question about him, all may end before his, so to say, absolute safe and unsuccessful historic life ends. This is what he's afraid of.
Абсолютно безпечне і невдале історичне життя. І ось чого він боїться.
And Zelenskyy on that was talking about an interview that the US representative Witkoff had given when he had visited Russia. He is Donald Trump's representative that was negotiating in Russia over some of the potential areas for a peace deal. And Witkoff effectively came out and was parroting exactly the Russian line. Now, Witkoff, when you look at him, he's a real estate man. He plays golf with Donald Trump, and that's the reason why he's been put forward to do this. And effectively, this is what Zelenskyy highlights in his interview. But Zelenskyy also asks who Vladimir Putin is afraid of, and he highlights and re-emphasizes the fact that Putin is afraid of his people and the destabilization of his society. The whole interview is fascinating. It's fascinating to see Zelenskyy responding in Ukrainian and the interpreter trying to keep up with it. But every now and again, and especially when the UK's BBC's Jeremy Bowen talks, he comes back at him with some of his answers in English. Zelenskyy is certainly doing the rounds and focusing on Europe to try and ensure that he remains at the forefront of European thinking, at the forefront of the coalition of the willing. Recommend that you watch that whole interview. Now, the other event that's been happening this week, it's not to do with Ukraine, but it's been dominating the news, is the posting of top secret attack details by the high levels of the US defense and intelligence community on the Signal platform. Donald Trump's got his views on this. Let's listen to what he has to say here.
They have been hit harder than they've ever been hit, and they want us to stop so badly. And they've got to stop. They've got to say no mas. But I can only say that the attacks, it's attacks every day, every night. It's not just the one. You're talking about one. The attacks have been very successful. Even beyond our wildest expectations. We've hit them very hard, very successfully, and we're going to do it for a long time. We're going to keep it going for a long time. I want to find if there's any mistake or if a Signal doesn't work. It could be that Signal is not very good. It's a company. Maybe it's not very good. I think we'd rather know about it now. Well, yeah, Mike Waltz, I guess he claimed responsibility, I would imagine. It had nothing to do with anyone else. It was Mike, I guess. I don't know. I was told it was Mike. But again, the attacks were unbelievably successful, and that's ultimately what you should be talking about, I think. Mike he took responsibility for it. Hegseth is doing a great job. He had nothing to do with this. Hegseth. How do you bring Hegseth into it? He had nothing to do. Look, it's all a witch hunt. Here we are talking about some of the greatest business deals ever made. The greatest companies in the world are moving into the United States, and you want to ask about whether or not Signal works. I don't know that Signal works. I think Signal could be defective, to be honest with you. And I think that's what we have to, because you use Signal and we use Signal and everybody uses Signal, but it could be a defective platform, and we're going to have to find that out.
Mr. Secretary.
Good morning, everybody. Nobody's texting war plans. Well, I noticed this morning out came something that doesn't look like war plans. And as a matter of fact, they even changed the title to attack plans because they know it's not war plans. There's no units, no locations, no routes, no flight paths, no sources, no methods, no classified information. And we'll keep putting our troops first. Thank you very much. We're heading off
Strike plans before they launched. Mr. Secretary, how do you square what you said with what your messages show? Mr. Secretary, did you share classified information? Mr. Secretary, did you declassify that information before you put it in the chat? Are you using Signal for sensitive operations? Why? Sir.
Donald Trump is coming out and trying to defend what his Secretary of State for Defense, Hesketh, had put out, and the detail that Hesketh had put out on this Signal messaging, and Signal is an encrypted messaging app, a bit like WhatsApp and a number of others, but it's not encrypted to military standards or certified for highly classified material. It's used by different government departments for gossip and bits and pieces. A journalist from the Atlantic magazine got accidentally added into the call and managed to record everything that was put in there, including screenshots of what was said. And what US Secretary of State for Defense did put on there was detailed attack sequencing of when aircraft were being launched from, I think it's the USS Nimitz, that's in the Red Sea, what time they would be over the target area, what the package of aircraft included. So it was F-18s of different types. There was ones with weapons on it. There were electronic warfare capable systems there, and also unmanned aerial vehicles with weapons on them, and gave the exact time as to when the weapons would guarantee to be dropped on the target. The CIA director came in and said that they had confirmed that the target had been destroyed, and that it was the target that they wanted because they saw the individual walking into a building where his girlfriend stayed, and they saw that the building had been destroyed. I've done targeting before. I've worked with the Americans in targeting before. This is classified at the highest levels. I've utilized some information that came through Freedom of Information Act. Using the Americans' own rules, this would have been classified at top secret in the run-up to and during the operation. And I would say there was probably a handling caveat on it of no foreign, which means no foreign dissemination of that material. That caveat may have had a separate caveat on it if there were tankers and other support for the US aircraft coming from other nations. I think there were British Voyager tankers in the area at the time, so they may have released some of that to the UK, but we don't know. And the argument from Donald Trump was there were no secrets in it. The argument from the Secretary of State for Defense was there were no secrets in it, and that's because the bit that said top secret had been torn off the top, or it wasn't typed in by Pete Hesketh, who'd typed it into the Signal messaging app. This is a severe lapse in security, and it shows an arrogance that only comes from a flawed ego if people think that this is appropriate to do and they can get away with it. And you look at all of the other people on the call, the Vice President J.D. Vance, he's politically naive, he's possibly security naive, but the director of the CIA, the National Intelligence Director, and others should have turned around and said, stop, delete immediately, this is not to happen. And then whenever it got caught out, they found out that the journalist was on there, why didn't they just turn around and say, this was a mistake, it shouldn't have happened, it was all done in the heat of the moment, and we thought it was a private group, lessons have been learned, we'll move on, instead of trying to defend it. So that's the recap for this week. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to put your comments below and sign up, please, for Times Radio membership. and you'll get more exclusive content and can put your questions and comments that I can answer in the other program next week. I'm Philip Ingram. Thank you for watching.